0430 hours, 28th of January 1945, the window in Eli Mercer's hut breathed frost like a wounded man's breath. Newspaper crackled under his palm as he pressed it to a broken pane, the paste already brittle in the cold. The cannon stove in the corner was a black, hungry mouth that hadn't spoken heat in hours. Outside, a whistle sliced the barracks row, one long blade of sound, and boots began their drum on hard snow. "Evacuation," someone muttered, but the word had a hollow core. Stalag Luft 4 would not be a place much longer. Men would become a column, and a column would become distance measured by lungs. Across an ocean furrowed by convoys, a different valve turned. In Kansas, technician 4th grade Ruth Alvarez eased a steel handle and felt the boiler through her fingertips before she heard it. A low, animal hum, pressure waking the pipes. The Camp Concordia bathhouse exhaled white into the pre-dawn, and beside her clipboard a stenciled sign read, "Soap first." A corporal counted towels like rations. Ruth noted temperature and SI in tight pencil, the language of order. Mercer shrugged his blanket and jostled Corporal Dwyer. The man's lashes were crusted with ice. "Up," Mercer said, keeping his voice level, the way he'd talk to a sophomore who brought a sleeve too near a lathe. They would be moving west. You could smell a front like an electrical fire, metallic and wrong long before flame. A shop teacher before the draft, he thought in systems. Coal equals heat. Windows equal less wind. Sugar equals one more mile. He palmed the sliver of chocolate he had saved since the Ardennes and let it melt like a secret. In Kansas, the line formed with its own discipline. German prisoners, farm boys, machinists, a few with Luftwaffe eagles threadbare, waited with towels folded like flags. A 6-head rig could handle an entire work detail in 20 minutes if the rotation didn't dawdle. 2 minutes under, no exceptions. It wasn't stinginess, it was throughput. Throughput turned promise into plan. War Department regulations required baths and medical inspections. Concordia had buildings, drums of fuel, men who knew which valve to tap when the line hammered. The whistle came again, and they spilled into a grey that wanted to be morning. The compound gate creaked. Guards hunched into greatcoats that looked warm and were not. Their knuckles were white. Mercer settled Dwyer into the ranks and marked the guards' faces the way you mark tools that will fail. The old man's jaw trembled. The boy with the new rifle stared at his boots. Snow underfoot squeaked like chalk. Behind them, the stove clicked and went still. At Concordia, first water thudded through cold pipe, and for a heartbeat the building rang with it, pipe hammer announcing power. Then the system took the load and went quiet. Ruth liked that second, the way force admitted itself and then behaved. She pressed a bar of soap into a prisoner's hand, and he stared as if she had issued a medal. Maybe it felt that way, the right to rinse yourself clean. Inspections showed regular baths reduced lice, disease, disorder. She had underlined those words. They were not abstractions. They were gallons and degrees. The column rolled past the tower's nailed-on wind vane onto the road. The cold had a taste, iron and ash. Mercer licked his lips and tasted dust from a county road in 1936, and it nearly undid him. He recited the parts of a Browning M 1919 in his head until the memory sat down and behaved. The wind found the seams in everything. Today would be seams and leaks, heat in Kansas, breath in Pomerania. Ruth wrote the time of the first rotation and did the math the way her father had done pump figures in a citrus house. 6 heads, 2 minutes each, turnover in 30 seconds. 100 men processed in under an hour. If the railheads kept fuel drums stacked like barrels of apples, she could repeat it hourly, and rumour would spread like warmth. The Americans will feed you, heat you, wash you. She had seen letters pass the censor with that message intact, as undeniable as steam above the roof. By noon, the march had set its rhythm. Crunch, pause, cough, command. A guard slipped and went to his knee. Mercer hauled him up by the strap of his rifle the same way he had hauled Dwyer, and the guard blinked as if the order of things had reversed. Maybe it had. Maybe the order of things was changing everywhere, in boilers and on roads, one valve at a time. Stalag Luft 4 kept its books even as the war unstitched them. Oberfeldwebel Franz Keller rubbed ink into his fingers and stared at the blank line where coal should have been entered. The requisition number was neat. The delivery box stayed empty. A sentry clomped by the window, his breath visible. Keller closed the ledger, cupped the chipped mug of ersatz coffee, and felt the rim nip his lip. Orders had arrived the night before. Prepare the prisoners for evacuation ahead of the front. The front advanced on its own schedule now, unmoved by timetables. He straightened his tunic and stepped into the administrative hut's corridor, a hallway of scuffed boots. The Luftwaffe sergeant at the end lifted a brow. "Rail?" Keller asked. The sergeant shook his head once. "Road," he said, and the word carried a weight measured in miles of snow. "Jawohl," Keller answered, because what else was there? He signed a movement order and wondered which rules could bend. A convoy rumbled somewhere beyond the pines. He imagined coal cars and then dismissed the thought. Across the Atlantic, Ruth Alvarez inked a simple request. Replacement circulation pump, bathhouse building 17, justification, maintain throughput under anticipated cold. If you wrote the right words, the right valve would turn. At Camp Concordia, the right words were regulation, schedule, inspection, powerful as ammunition belts. Her lieutenant initialed the chit before she finished explaining. "Get it done, Alvarez," he said. Yesterday the pipes had sung, hammer in the line, until she tweaked the air vent with a spanner. She stepped into Kansas air-sharp as an apple and watched steam lift from the roof as if the building were breathing. German prisoners formed a queue. Soap first, rinse fast, towels in the bin, a liturgy in any language. She knew the Geneva rules as practice, latrines drained, medical inspection scheduled, baths regular as reveille. If a shower cycle slipped, lice would rise. Then sickness. Her pencil turned those ifs into numbers and the numbers into an argument both conscience and calculator could respect. Keller sent runners to count blankets and boots. He ordered windows patched with cardboard and warned the guards not to waste matches on cigarettes. He walked the barracks rows and smelled disinfectant and sawdust, the rare morning when a stove took. Not this morning. He paused by a hut and told a young American, "Bald," soon, and the word sounded wrong. A prisoner, thin and polite, had asked if the march would be long. Keller had answered because that was the habit of authority. Ruth's replacement pump arrived before noon, bolted into a crate like a promise. She and a private muscled it into place. When she brought the system back online, the gauge needle climbed without complaint, a small triumph with large consequences. A 6-head rig at full flow could service 100 men in under an hour. 2 such rigs in staggered cycles turned a day into capacity. She understood the arithmetic of mercy. The United States could heat water for enemy soldiers daily, while the enemy rationed heat for its own guards. That contrast could be counted in gallons and stacked towels, and the silence of a building doing its job. He had been trained to believe discipline squared the circle, press men hard enough and numbers obeyed. But the numbers no longer belonged to him. Coal quotas were fiction. Trains obeyed bombers. A stove burned for an hour and then fell quiet. He briefed his corporals with clipped certainty, then dismissed them with emotion that lacked conviction by a gram. He would keep the men alive if he could. He would keep the prisoners alive if the road allowed it. He doubted both. The first prisoner column formed as Ruth signed off her afternoon inspection. Weather touched both. Human systems could not have been more different. One starved, one fed, one improvised, one inspected. Mercer nudged his friend forward. Keller lifted his hand and made a circle in the air. "Move out." Ruth set the clipboard down and turned the handle an eighth of a turn to trim heat. Each motion was small. Each motion mattered. Snow sifted like ash through the broken glazing of a barracks at Bad Orb, while a Swiss delegate tried to keep his pencil moving. His breath fogged the page, and he wrote, "Windows broken, vermin present, washing absent, fuel insufficient." He capped the pencil and rubbed his fingers back to feeling. Inside, men pulled blankets higher and made themselves small. Reports would travel to Geneva. The cold did not read. Eli Mercer stood near the wall where boards blocked one gap and cardboard another. He felt the seams with his palm. Warmth escaped at the weakest joint. He'd learned that in a machine shop long before a rifle had weight. The guards had promised a move to better quarters. He didn't argue. Argument spent heat. He watched for small advantages, where a draft bent away from the floor, a stove door angled to throw shin-height warmth. The column would form soon enough. For now, he counted seconds of comfort and banked them. In Kansas, Ruth Alvarez opened the bathhouse door and the smell met her. Lye, damp cotton, a whisper of fuel oil, clean as discipline. The replacement pump purred, the gauge held. The first 6 heads rolled a coin-bright stream. She logged 0600 complete and checked the trash. Inspection was respect. The first prisoner in line, a boy with hay stuck to his cuffs from a farm detail, stepped under. He reached for the chain and flinched at the warmth, as if it were a trick. It was no trick. This was the plan. Camp Concordia counted 304 buildings. Barracks, kitchens, hospital, cold storage, latrines, bathhouses. A 6 or 9 head bank moved roughly 1,200 gallons an hour. Before breakfast, the bathhouse would likely push more hot water than a compound in Hesse could spare in a week. It was a comparison written in pipes. The United States treated regulation as valves, schedules, and people trained to use both. Keller walked the perimeter, scarf smelling of damp wool. He had told the delegate the truth: fuel delayed, glazing to be repaired when material arrived, prisoners to be moved before artillery persuaded everyone. The man had nodded, expression grave, and written without judgment. Keller appreciated it and the silence that followed. Judgment was cheap now, coal the only expensive word. He paused by a hut and told a young American, "Bald?" Soon, and the word sounded like a promise he could not keep. Ruth watched prisoners step in, step out, scrub with practiced economy. She taught a new private how to bleed air from the high point in the line, how to listen for hammer, how to close a valve a quarter turn. 2 rigs staggered, meant 200 by chow, 400 by late morning, 600 by noon. The numbers weren't pretty, they were bridge beautiful, strength made visible. The private nodded, grateful for a language learned in an afternoon. Mercer helped Dwyer lace boots with fingers that didn't quite belong to him. He told a flat farm ice joke to set a beat. A corporal down the row coughed like breaking kindling. Someone slid a scrap of cardboard toward the window, and 3 hands wedged it where the wind found purchase. Machinists did the same to a leaky seal. Block it, brace it, buy time. He would have done the same with his own ribs. A rumour arrived by letter at the Kansas post office and made its way after censorship to a camp mailbox. Vogel unfolded the page. His wife had drawn a small star in one corner. She wrote little. The factory stood. Their son still asked for bread. Snow made the street quiet. He did not complain. He described bathhouse, inspections, schedule, the predictability that made him feel human. He wrote that Americans counted towels the way Germans counted shells, and the counting made something steady inside him. By afternoon, the sky over Hesse lowered and wind angled snow into the barracks. The delegate finished his notes and slipped them into a leather case. He would send them along roads that might not exist tomorrow. Keller gathered his corporals and spoke a script. Prepare to move, issue blankets, maintain order. He spoke it flat, words frost-stiff. On the other side of the world, the bathhouse roof trailed steam like a flag, and Ruth marked the last rotation complete. Somewhere between them, empty ship holds already waited for their next human cargo. Night marched with them, a black partner that set the tempo. Crunch of ice, breath like torn paper, the small-pained noises men make when they try not to. Mercer set his shoulder under Dwyer's arm and counted aloud in a voice soft enough not to irritate the guards and loud enough to keep lungs working. The road ran like a frozen river between firs. The stars were hammered flat and bright. Somewhere ahead there would be a halt, then another. He knew the drill, distance bent by rhythm, by jokes without punchlines, by the memory of coffee in an Ohio kitchen. A guard went down on slick rifle skittering. Mercer grabbed the sling and heaved. The guard blinked once in thanks and then scowled. Keller kept the column tight without making it cruel. He had learned the art. He let men lag by a pace if their feet found purchase and hustled them when the wind shifted and tried to take the column apart. The map in his pocket said a village lay ahead. Maps were storytellers now. He would have called it prudence once. Now it felt like treachery. At Concordia, 0500 came and Ruth reported to the boiler like a crew chief. The gauge had slipped a degree. She adjusted the feed and listened to the change settle through the line. First steam at 0600, work details to follow. A private handed her a repair note for a leaking union. She ran a hand along the pipe, turned a quarter, and the bead vanished. "Keep the towels high," she said. He nodded with the solemnity privates give knowledge. A boiler tolerated respect when it came with wrenches. The halt came, and with it the ritual. Fall in a ditch out of the wind, stamp feet, rub hands, trade positions, so no one kept a place long enough to freeze in it. Mercer chewed the last corner of the chocolate until it became a memory and then a story about a 5-and-dime girl's wink that, he now knew, had been for the candy, not him. Dwyer smiled with one side of his mouth and said, "She had taste." The guard with the new rifle almost smiled, then remembered who he was meant to be. Keller burned 2 forms in a town hall stove and shut the grate because 2 pieces of paper were not a future. He sent a corporal with a cracked pane to the doctor's office, where 2 panes were missing and the wind practiced its knife work. Precaution would not save anyone, but it shaved the edge off disaster. He had a son reading Latin verbs in Saxony and wondered if the teacher had started burning old maps. Ruth's first rotation went like a drill team, water moving in one shining arc. She thought systems became merciful when tuned. A quarter turn and a 5-minute shift could save a dozen men from fever later. The math wasn't sentimental, it was preventive. Bath doctrine read like a manual. The result read like kindness. The march resumed. The day opened another grey page. Men stumbled and recovered. One guard's hands went the wrong colour. Keller took the scarf from his own neck and wrapped it around the boy's wrists, then swore at himself for the impulse. The boy was young and wore the look of someone who still thought memorizing regulations would change weather. Mercer thought of the M1919 not as a gun, but as a list of parts assembled into something that worked. He wanted to be a list again, ordered, functional. Near noon, the column passed open coal wagons under a rind of snow, a sergeant counting prisoners against tonnage. Mercer smelled it, good coal is sweet, and had to lock his jaw to keep from laughing. The world still had wealth. It had drifted away from people. He swallowed the laugh and moved Dwyer along. Somewhere, America heated water for the enemy on purpose. Somewhere, a boiler hummed at the exact pressure it preferred. He walked toward that fact as if it were a fire seen at a distance. A Liberty ship rode the Atlantic slow and stubborn, her cargo holds strung with hammocks where tanks had nested on the eastbound leg. Coffee steamed in the galley, boots clacked on steel. A petty officer read names in a voice that made them sound fixed. Westbound meant empty by the old logic. In 1945, westbound meant human cargo. You could feel the repurposing in the deck plates, gears running backward to make peace. Ruth Alvarez did not see the ship, but its consequence arrived in Kansas by timetable. Trains set down prisoners of war as matter-of-factly as mail. A guard detail walked them to orientation. A medic eyed them for fever. A clerk filed them into numbered housing. She admired the bureaucracy she'd once feared. It did not arrest you. It held you so good things could find you. Doctors, blankets, hot water. Regulations read dry on paper and came alive as steam against a spine. Someone had promised this in Geneva a generation earlier. The promise now wore boots and carried a wrench. Concordia scaled mercy like a factory scaled output. A six-head bank at 1,200 gallons an hour sounded like hardware, but it was really an oath to keep bodies clean at a rate the weather could not defeat. 2 banks staggered meant hundreds by midday and, if labour required, thousands by week's end. The hospital's disinfectors scalded lice out of cloth on cycles that looked like music on a clipboard. Ruth walked those routes with a supervisor's eye and a medic's care, tightening a union here, tapping an air vent there, talking to men about towels and soap as if they were rations and ammunition. In a way, they were. Dirt and disease were enemies. Warmth and water were weapons. Vogel wrote letters he did not expect to pass, and they did because he wrote about ordinary things, the smell of the laundry shed, the way books appeared in a camp library like gifts, the astonishing routine of a shower that arrived when a clock said it would. He asked for news of Saxony and read between the lines of what his wife did not say. He had come to understand mercy could be counted. Calorie tables and bath rotations were not kindness as a feeling, but kindness made mechanical. Keller watched surrender become a weather report. Clear Monday, overcast Tuesday, heavy Wednesday with scattered resistance. He suspected the Americans' real secret was the reliable rumour of what surrender looked like. The rumour said you kept your name, your boots, your blanket if you had one. You saw a doctor. You stood in a line that led to soap and then to bread. It was not softness. It was ruthless predictability that stripped bravery of its uses. By spring, the United States would hold more than 400,000 German POWs in continental camps, death in custody a tiny fraction of 1%, figures that next to winter in Germany looked like separate wars. You could say the difference was geography. Truer, fuel, truest, that democracy kept promises because it could and because it chose to. The ledger balanced both sides, capability and will. She said please to privates and thank you to Germans who followed directions. She used names. She fixed things in front of people. A bathhouse is a factory for dignity, she told a new corporal. He wrote it as doctrine. It was doctrine older than field manuals and tougher than concrete. People behave in the presence of care. Proof was on the floor, wet footprints in orderly rows that dried in the same pattern every day. If a footprint broke the pattern, she checked on its owner. On Sunday, the chaplain spoke a few words over a work detail's benches and blessed no one in particular. Shipyards for Liberty hulls, refineries for fuel, railroads across prairie, a bathhouse built to regulation. These weren't separate stories, but one argument of steel and habit. If the argument sounded gentle, it was because its power ran quiet when it ran well. At dusk, she closed the boiler and signed the logbook. The gauge rested where she had left it, as if numbers could hold a room together. Somewhere a train whistled, and men who'd been enemies yesterday counted towels the way Ruth counted wrenches. She put her hand on the warm skin of the pipe and understood winning was sometimes exactly this temperature and no hotter. Keller had learned to do math without paper. He counted matches, boots that would last another day, the time a man could stand before his hands forgot who owned them. He counted rumour too, because rumour brought companies in whole cloth. Across the lines, a sergeant decided the story about American camps, doctors, heat, showers, bread, wasn't a trick. Keller didn't resent it. He envied a war that kept promises. On the road west, the column met a crosswind that felt like it came from iron. Mercer angled his body to break it for Dwyer and thought about order as if it were a thing you could pocket and take out when needed. He spoke in shop-class rhythms, steady now, heel then toe, and the column carried a little further on that cadence. You didn't win a day, you carried it. In Kansas, Ruth wrote the morning throughput in a log whose pages had begun to seem like scripture for the practical. The numbers were ordinary and astonishing. 2 banks, 2 minutes apiece, turnover in 30 seconds, hundreds of men processed by Chow. It was not a speech, it was a schedule. A visiting inspector asked how many showerheads could be brought online at once. Ruth did the math in her head and named a figure that would have sounded absurd in Hesse in January. A single American cantonment, she told him, could likely field more hot water heads than a German military district by late winter. She said it with the tired certainty of a technician who knows what's on the shelf. Vogel's letter made a tour of a West Wall dugout before it ever reached Saxony. Men hunched around a candle for the idea of control. Someone read aloud the sentence about towels counted the way shells were counted, and a man laughed under his breath because the comparison was obvious and irresistible. Americana, he said, but it did not sound like an insult. It sounded like weather you could plan for. When the shelling resumed, they tucked the letter into a helmet for luck. Keller walked the column, feeling for edges where it might tear. When a man stumbled, he swapped him forward to where a wagon's lee took the wind off. He kept enough discipline for cohesion and enough mercy to keep it from turning feral. He calculated the day in kilometres and heartbeats, and knew both could run out. He had once believed drill alone made an army. Now he suspected supply made the difference between an army and a crowd. Ruth supervised a delousing cycle and watched steam billow out of a disinfecting drum like a factory's hymn. She had read notes that a 6-head field rig, run hard, supported 400 men in a day. Numbers like that would have sounded like boasting, unless you stood in a room where valves turned on time. If rails stayed steady and parts kept arriving, she could maintain that pace without drama. That was the point, to make the astonishing routine. In a war built on shock, routine was the quietest miracle. By afternoon, Mercer heard artillery like someone dragging furniture 2 streets over. They halted under trees whose branches shook off powder like a dog shakes water. A guard's hands went the wrong colour. Keller unwrapped his scarf and looped it around the boy's wrists and told him to move his fingers until they belonged to him again. The boy said, "Jawohl," in a schoolroom voice. The word made Keller think of his own son and of a classroom where present and absent still meant what they said. In the mess, someone wrote the week's statistics on a slate: calories per prisoner, baths completed, medical inspections conducted. The numbers were not confetti, they were commitments. A Milltown chaplain stood looking at them and said nothing, his best sermon. Ruth ate soup with her back against warm masonry and felt her muscles believe the wall. The rumour thickened into knowledge. Liberty ships brought tens of thousands west every month, and trains braided them inland where camps held them at a standard so exact that Texas and Kansas were indistinguishable by smell and schedule. For men who'd lived in the weather too long, that sameness was deliverance enough. The war would not end because a boiler stayed on pressure, yet hour by hour that steadiness made surrender rational. At dusk, Keller tallied matches and understood the equation: fight to freeze, or stop and be warmed by the enemy. He chose not to argue with math anymore. The depot yard breathed like a beast at idle, each boxcar a lung, each manifest a heartbeat, and Ruth Alvarez walked its arteries with a clipboard that had more authority than a pistol. The bathhouse finished the 0600 rotation and cycled again by 0745, towels strung along a wire. She had learned preventive maintenance the way a squad leader learns fields of fire: bleed high points, grease couplings, change a gasket before it screams. One seized bearing could steal an hour and rupture morale. Her hand found the warm seam of a pipe and listened. No hammer. On the prairie, winter light made labour look holy. Prisoners came off trucks smelling of wool and fatigue, boots muddy from beet fields or brush clearing by the river. In another country, they would have stacked clogs. Here they kept shoes laced and shoulders covered between shower and issue line because policy treated bodies as machines built for a long campaign. Ruth watched a hitch in a man's gait and sent him to the medic before he asked. She adjusted the stagger between banks by 8 minutes and noted how the pressure gauge recovered faster, the needle drifting back to nominal. Mercer's world still measured itself in breaths and steps, but a new cadence crept in. Artillery farther west, talking in a tone that meant rescue. He marked the guard's fatigue the way a machinist marks wear. What clicks now will grind later. Dwyer walked lighter when the road faced the wind at a kinder angle, and Mercer planned jokes like rations, dole them out so the column didn't notice the miles stealing past. At a halt, he counted the seconds he could stand within shin range of a field stove, banking heat in the bones. Keller stopped pretending the mail would bring coal and began to treat kindness as a ration too scarce to waste and too necessary to deny. He shifted a guard with a dead stare to the rear where wind broke around wagons. He allowed a prisoner to stand a little straighter at inspection because he had seen posture return a minute of courage. It was not sentiment. Men who felt seen kept moving. Men who felt erased fell and took others with them. He managed a crowd the way he would manage a bulky machine, adjust inputs, prevent seizures. Back in Kansas, Ruth ran an experiment no manual mentioned. 2 staggered waves through the 6-head banks decreased line shock and kept pressure steady. The medic reported fewer fainting episodes after shower and before chow. She wrote it down as proof that a well-timed valve could steal a victory from chaos. The numbers said it for her. 2 banks, 2 minutes apiece, turnover in 30 seconds, hundreds processed by noon. Vogel learned the bathhouse's music the way he had learned bread browning. The first hiss of steam, the murmur of men, the hollow slap of water against tile. He stood his turn and thought about the letter he would write when he could name this routine without sounding ungrateful to those at home. He had believed uniforms decided a man's worth. Now a woman with a wrench and a clipboard decided whether his day held fever or not. It felt like the opposite of fear. At midday, a freight whistle stitched the air. Fuel drums thudded into the yard. Ruth checked the manifest and smiled at heat delivered to a building that made heat into mercy. A private asked why towels were counted like ammunition. "Because tomorrow depends on today balancing," she said, and he penciled the phrase inside his cap. In late afternoon, she stood in the doorway and watched the prairie bruise to purple. The bathhouse exhaled a steady plume. She counted heads against plan and found herself within one, the kind of precision that makes a commander trust a subordinate. Somewhere beyond the horizon, men were choosing to live because others had chosen to make mercy unavoidable. The boiler's hum sounded to her like a hymn that did not end. The last rotation finished 2 minutes ahead of schedule. She closed a valve an eighth of a turn, laid her palm on warm pipe, and felt the building answer. On the far side of the ocean, a road hardened by cold carried a column west. 2 lines moved through winter, one towards steam, one away from frost. The math said the first would win, and Ruth believed it to the bone. She knew the doctrine by heart. Baths and medical inspection on schedule, latrines kept, records reconciled nightly. A 6-head bank moving roughly 1,200 gallons an hour, run hard but not abused, could carry a cantonment through winter without drama, which was the point, astonishing capacity made routine. The night broke them into smaller units, pairs, then singles, then the stubborn core a man can carry alone. Mercer learned to read the sky for a shift of wind, and the guards for which ones would permit the small mercies that keep columns from shattering. He swapped places with Dwyer to put the weaker man in the lee of a wagon and bought him 30 minutes of less misery. Ice made their boots feel carved from iron. Warmth, when it arrived, came from friction or luck. They moved with the careful waste of men who know that rushing is expensive. Keller's orders had become a prayer. Maintain order, conserve strength, avoid contact, deliver prisoners intact. The paper was typed in a warm office by a hand whose fountain pen had never frozen. Keller kept it in an inner pocket where body heat smudged the ink. He enforced discipline without bile because bile cost heat. When the column reached a barn with one wall and 3 intact stalls, he sent the worst off inside and posted a double sentry to keep men from smothering on their own steam. Authority meant triage, and triage meant choosing the least cruel option quickly. At dawn, an ICRC lorry coughed along the road and stopped long enough to ask questions, make notes, and hand over a bundle of bandages to a guard whose thanks came out as steam. The delegate's eyes watered. Wind will make any man weep. He would draft a report that recorded cold in measured words. Even reports freeze. Aid was a travelling campfire that could not stay. Columns depend on moving. Keller nodded as if saluting. He had seen how help, lingered over long, turned order into a dangerous wish. Mercer counted guards as carefully as he counted his own breath, sorting the brutal from the exhausted, which are often the same men on different days. He knew who would look away while a man tightened a lace a second longer and who would use that second as pretext to swing a rifle butt. He watched the guard with the schoolroom jawline, the one Keller had wrapped with a scarf, and angled Dwyer where that boy could see colour returning to hands. "You're teaching him," Dwyer whispered. Mercer shook his head. "I'm giving him something to copy." Imitation is the lowest energy form of hope. In Kansas, the bathhouse ran quieter than a church with a good choir. A new private turned a valve too fast, spiking the line with a hammer clang, and Ruth tapped his knuckles with a wrench, a ritual older than both of them. "Quarter turn," she said. "Between too slow and too proud is right." He repeated the motion on a second valve and felt the pipe consent. She marked the maintenance log with an asterisk and would check his work in an hour to prove trust. The hum of the pump was the sound of a building agreeing. The winter's arithmetic announced itself on 2 slates a world apart. In Hesse, a clerk wrote fuel, insufficient, windows broken, men cold. In Kansas, a corporal chalked showers by noon, 400, towels laundered, 400, delousing cycles, 2 complete. It would have been obscene if it were not the point. The United States could afford to make clean routine. Germany could not afford to make warmth routine for its own guards. Keller felt the insult in his bones and called the column to march before envy grew teeth. A farmer at a camp gate watched a POW detail march by in field grey and told Ruth, "They look like our boys if you squint." She shrugged. "They look like work," she said, and the farmer accepted the correction because she spoke without heat. She was not sentimental about men. She was sentimental about pressure gauges that held steady and towels folded to regulation and bars of soap signed out in the morning and back by night. Sentiment on those topics built a world that held. Near evening, the column crossed a small bridge over black water, and every man leaned toward the rail like a plant toward a window. Keller let them pause for a count of 30 and then moved them on, the way you take a book from a child who must sleep. He knew the art of enough, and enough sometimes meant a minute of beauty that hurt. Mercer used the minute to shake the last grit of chocolate from his pocket and share it. Dwyer's eyes steadied. The bridge looked like a drawing from an elementary reader, and for that half-minute they remembered pages instead of miles. The village came up out of the frost like a concession, roofs hunched and chimneys writing pale script against a washed sky. Keller saw armour at the hedge. American, by the way, it sat like it owned the road, and understood the math of the morning in a glance. He stacked rifles in the ditch, muzzle to muzzle, the way he'd been taught when surrender was a drill and not a confession. Hands up, palms forward, voice steady enough to keep his men from panicking and the prisoners from bolting. He felt something unlock inside, the hinge that had kept duty and futility lashed together through a season of cold. To his astonishment, relief sounded like boots standing still. Mercer saw the same silhouettes and felt the same calculus arrive. He did not run. He moved with the dignity of a man who wanted to be seen as salvageable. A tank idled like heavy weather. A private in a wool cap took one look at the column, lifted a hand, and barked for medics and blankets the way a good sergeant calls for fire. The sudden competence was almost violent. Men were sorted by colour and cough, by wobble and eye focus, and moved toward heat. It was triage, but it felt like someone had opened a door and decided not to close it again. Ruth could not see that field, but she was in it by correspondence. The bathhouse took the day's work detachments and moved them through like wheat through a mill. She had arranged a supplemental shift and argued for more socks to match the shower cycle. Wet feet undo intentions. A quarter turn here, an extra towel there, a guard who learned to say faster in a tone that meant, please. She understood her role in the quiet offensive. If surrender rested on a story of predictable care, then her valves and ledgers wrote a paragraph each hour. Keller addressed the American lieutenant with sentences that did not wobble. He identified himself, his men, his prisoners, his intent. He used the good words first: order, transfer, intact, because they reassured everyone that the scene would stay human. The lieutenant nodded, crisp and tired, and began the paperwork that makes surrender more than a tableau. Keller watched his name become a file and felt relief as precise as the moment a fever breaks. Mercer's feet met a blanket as if the cloth had intentions. A cook put a tin mug of broth in his hands, and the heat went from palm to shoulder to throat, a road reversed. He would remember the weight of that mug more precisely than any medal, the sensation of fingers thawing into themselves. Later, he would say this was the first American weapon he felt after capture. He did not mean the tank. He meant a kitchen organized to go to war. Vogel that afternoon read a notice on the camp board. Additional classes in English after evening meal. Shower rotations extended by 1 hour to accommodate arrivals. The scale was not a boast. It was accommodation in the old sense, to make space inside a house for guests you did not invite. He thought of Keller's clipped instruction voice and wondered if his former sergeant would recognize this version of order. He suspected he would, and that recognition would land like a bench finally level on its legs. By spring of 1945, tens of thousands of German soldiers would surrender each month along the Western Front, and more than 400,000 would pass through camps in the United States, where mortality hovered at a tiny fraction of a percent. The figure sounded like propaganda until you saw a bathhouse schedule and a medic's log and a ledger for socks that reconciled at week's end. The impossible-seeming truth was that democracy's strength expressed itself at scale as predictability. When a man knows what will happen to his body, he stops gambling it against winter. The tank coughed, settled, and fell silent. Paper moved between men who had chosen systems over pride. Keller looked at the guard whose hands had been the wrong colour 2 days ago and saw pink. Mercer drank to the bottom and saw a future that smelled like oil and wood shavings. Ruth signed the 1600 line and smiled because figures balanced in a way nothing else had since December. Quartermasters say war is logistics. She thought war might also be the quiet breath of a boiler kept on pressure all day. In the records that evening, the lieutenant wrote simply, "Received prisoners in good order. Food and hygiene provided per regulation. No incidents." The line read dull. Its effect was thunder. Ruth chalked a flowchart on a board for a young lieutenant who thought boilers were beneath him until she turned the arrows into lives. Ship to rail, rail to camp, camp to bath and medical, bath to barracks and work detail, work to repatriation by treaty. He watched the chalk become policy, and policy become the opposite of accident. She wrote 3 numbers in a corner, more than 400,000 processed mortality at a tiny fraction of a percent, showers counted in thousands per day, then set the chalk down and opened a valve a quarter turn to show how ideas become pressure. Mercer sat in a tent warmed by a stove that behaved itself and listened to a medic explain frostbite in language that owed a debt to shop class. Tissue fails when pipes freeze. You do not strike a frozen part to wake it. You introduce warmth the way you bring a cold engine to life. He nodded at the practical theology and asked for socks. The medic produced a pair like a ritual object. A memory of pooled snow under a broken window loosened its grip, and for a minute he let himself imagine the road home as a series of valves opening on time. Keller, on the other side of a line that had moved over him like weather, answered questions into a clean notebook. How many? How far? What rations? He told the truth in the tone men use when they have stopped trying to improve the story. Coal had been rumour, command a habit that kept hands busy when power had gone elsewhere. He admitted he rationed decency because he could not, that winter, ration fuel. The American captain wrote without comment, a respectful grace Keller felt like heat. The bathhouse read its own scripture of care. A 6-head rig taught the lesson that gallons per hour were not trivia, but doctrine executed. Disinfecting drums sang, rising and falling with loads of clothing that returned as tools rather than vectors. Ruth traced a finger along a pipe seam and felt no leak. The satisfaction was physical. A private asked why such precision for enemy soldiers. "Because we said we would," she answered, "and because keeping that promise saves our men up front." The boy nodded as if a mystery had unknotted. Numbers piled up like sandbags against chaos. Train schedules hit their marks often enough that a man could stand in a Kansas sunset and predict where another man in Texas would be bathed by 1,800. Mortality figures sounded like a miracle to anyone who had heard of camps in other theatres where death rates were measured with awful zeros. The comparison was not for boasting, it was for policy, so that no future winter could claim the same excuse. Ruth believed memory lived best in routines that left no space for neglect. Mercer slept and woke inside a fatigue that owed a tithe to relief. Food tasted like a story told well. He asked a cook about the boiler as if speaking to a brother tradesman, and the man showed him the valve and gauge like heirlooms. Mercer decided he would stand in front of a blackboard again and teach boys about heat and metal with the seriousness of survival. The first lesson would be about friction, how a little less can mean a life kept whole. At battalion, a staff officer wrote a memo with the quiet force of a verdict. Predictable, humane treatment of POWs reduces enemy resistance and conserves friendly combat power. Recommend strict adherence to Geneva and expansion of hygiene and medical capacity. The sentence made itself policy because it merely described reality. Keller would not read it, but he would live under its shelter until war's end. Ruth did not see it, but she heard it every time the gauge settled where it should. The lieutenant from the chalkboard returned with a question about throughput, and Ruth answered with a demonstration instead of a lecture. She turned a valve a fraction, then back, and let him hear the line quiet itself. He nodded, newly attentive to the eloquence of pipes. Somewhere a rail schedule ticked over another column of arrivals, and the bathhouse, ready as a barracks of surgeons, took up the load. In a quiet aside, the lieutenant asked if the numbers were exaggeration. Ruth pointed to a wall map pricked with flags, camps scattered across the plains and south, railheads feeding them like capillaries, and explained backhaul. Liberty ships that carried tanks east returned with prisoners west, then trains braided them inland. A single cantonment could field more hot water heads than some German districts could keep fueled by late winter. "Nothing mystical," she said. "Just steel, fuel, and a promise kept on schedule." Vogel stepped into a bakery that still smelled faintly of plaster and dust and set a tin cup beneath the boiler's spigot as if beginning a service. Saxony had learned to be quiet when it cooked. He lit the pilot with hands that remembered Kansas heat and listened for the same small assent a pipe gives when it is pleased to work. The poster he had pinned above the boiler, "Safety First," was American in fonts and faith. He told his wife he had learned to love checklists because they steal accidents from the future. She laughed and handed him flour as if to bless the notion. In a town hall that had known lighter songs, Keller sat before a table and gave testimony in a voice that had recovered some of its body. He did not excuse. He explained how rumour fought the Reich better than bullets by the end, how soldiers who believed in a bath and a bowl of soup moved toward surrender like iron to a magnet. Germany's scarcity had defeated its cruelty, he said, because cruelty, stripped of fuel, becomes only wind. He had learned to measure decency the way he once measured ammunition, count it, protect it, and spend it where it changed outcomes. Ruth took her sergeant's stripes off with a seam ripper and rolled them into a film canister she would keep in a drawer for the rest of her life. The GI Bill pamphlet looked like a ticket. She registered for engineering at a state college where the radiators sang in winter and farmtown girls carried slide rules like another kind of prayer book. She finished problem sets early because she had solved them once with wrenches and night shifts. A professor, a veteran with oil under his nails, said, "Systems are people, Miss Alvarez." She nodded. She had known that since Kansas. Mercer returned to a classroom where boys banged stools in a rhythm that tried to be martial and was only loud. He laid a Browning M 1919 schematic beside a boiler diagram and taught both as if they described the same truth. Energy channeled for use rather than waste. He spoke without drama about a road march that had taught him the price of friction. When a student asked if war had a smell, he said yes, metal, wet wool, and sometimes soap when you're lucky, and the room quieted as if it had heard an oath. The camps emptied on schedules that looked like train timetables because they were. Repatriation cut a path back across oceans where ships had learned a second purpose. Mortality in American custody had remained the kind of fraction statisticians admire out loud, but veterans preferred a simpler account. Men they had fought were now ploughing fields with backs unbroken by cold. The Geneva Articles moved from pamphlets into habits and then into expectations. That is how law becomes culture. A letter came to Ruth on heavy paper from a German she did not recognize. He wrote in careful English that the first hot shower he had taken in America had made him believe the world might not be an enemy forever, and that he now taught apprentices to treat tools as if someone they loved would hold them next. He signed with a long name and a small drawing of a loaf. She filed the letter under her stripes and thought about an equation that had carried its answer across a language. Keller visited a classroom where his son wrestled with Latin that had been interrupted by history and stood at the back while the boy translated a sentence about rivers returning to their courses. He had watched rivers climb their banks and freeze in strange shapes. He wanted to believe in courses again. Outside, a worker knocked ice from a gutter with a broom handle and laughed when it shattered, and Keller heard in the sound the small beginning of a rebuild. The winter receded in layers, the way a bruise fades from purple to patience. In Kansas, a bathhouse that had been a factory for dignity became a warehouse and then a memory that smelled of lie. In classrooms and shops and kitchens, the war's quiet doctrine persisted: quarter turn, preventive check, promises kept on schedule. The people who had learned it in steam and snow carried it into peace until it felt like common sense, which is another name for victory that no one needs to shout. On certain mornings, Ruth still woke at 05:30, as if the gauge might need her hand, and she would make coffee, listen to the quiet pipes in her building, and feel grateful for a world where pressure held without watching. The last chapter of that winter opened with a quiet symmetry. Breath clouding a barracks in a country that had run out of coal, steam drifting from a bathhouse roof in a country that had not. From that pairing, a history could be written that asked less about flags than about valves. Eli Mercer stood in a yard where snow had learned to fall softly again and felt his toes ache their way back into ownership. He watched a medic unroll clean bandage like a sacrament. The doctor said, almost conversational, that the body wants to forgive you if you give it a reason. Mercer stared at his hands and believed him because he could see the reason in steam. Ruth, speaking to trainees who would run hospitals for a peace that wanted to arrive on schedule, told them the war could be summarised in 2 maintenance phrases: quarter turn, preventive check. The room smiled. She wrote on the board the numbers that explained how Mercy had scaled. Hundreds processed daily by a single cantonment, thousands by a network, more than 400,000 enemy soldiers held safely through war's end, with a death rate so low it made drama look small next to doctrine. She underlined schedule and closed the cap of her pen the way she once closed a valve. Keller, seated at a long table in a room and owed nothing, listened as a younger officer lectured about Geneva compliance and strategic effect. The language was new, but the facts were his. Men surrendered sooner when they trusted the capture. Columns held shape when guards could say, "We will keep you alive," and mean it. Cruelty wasted calories and coal both. He thought of the scarf he had wrapped around a boy's wrists and decided it had been the first true order he had given all winter. Vogel audited an evening class in English at a technical school where the light was good and benches were scarred with honest work. The teacher used the future perfect to describe repatriation. By such and such a date, you will have returned. The tense felt like generosity. He turned the sentence the way a baker turns a loaf and found it sound. He walked home along a river that had made shrapnel sounds when it froze and now ran as if a valve had opened upstream. He thought, someone kept a promise to time. The strategic memorandum that closed the case was brief and therefore persuasive. It argued that humane logistics, baths, calories, medical inspections conducted as scheduled, had shortened the war at the margin by making surrender rational and last-ditch resistance less likely. It recommended continued investment in hygiene infrastructure, not as charity, but as national defence. The logic was simple and had been proven in steam and in snow. Policy followed the path already worn smooth by practice. A historian would later call it an irony that democracy had won by being more disciplined than dictatorship at the level of pipes and schedules. A machinist would call it ordinary, treat a system with respect, and it gives you more than you asked for. An infantryman would say it another way. If you promise socks and soup and don't lie, the enemy will come over the hill with his hands up sooner. All 3 would be right. The lesson had been paid for with frost-bitten fingers and midnight maintenance checks. Mercer returned to a lathe that sang a different note after the war. The note machines sing when they are used for building and not breaking. He ran a fingertip along the coolant line and thought about a pipe in Kansas that had answered with warmth through his friend's hands. He held up a battered tin mug and said this saved me, and the boys laughed until he explained the weight of it in a frozen yard. Ruth closed a boiler for the last time when the camp became a warehouse for seed. She stood in the doorway, listened to the line fall silent, and felt the war stand still and wait for her to nod it into history. She did, then went to class where equations described flows that would irrigate fields and run hospitals. Her hands remembered the quarter turn like a song. The closing image belongs to the winter because it deserves the last word. Breath in a freezing hut, its ghosts rising and vanishing. Steam over a concrete roof, rising and vanishing. Between those 2 vanishing acts lay a victory measured not only in miles taken, but in degrees maintained, in gallons flowed, in socks issued, in rumours that turned men toward life. The world that followed inherited that arithmetic and was better for it. When the next cold front came down, the checklist was ready.